Well, welcome back everyone. Huge well done and thank you for being back promptly at 11:30. Now look, we've already heard this morning that this is not just a UK challenge but a global one. So our next panel session is really going to get stuck into how can the UK lead and collaborate in the international transition? Where can we show leadership? Where can we help with collaboration? And where can some of our pioneering finance and tech play a lead in solutions for the rest of the world? To steer us through that, we're joined by Rain Newton-Smith, the CBI's Chief Economist, Thomas Fennan, founder of 18 East, and Andrew Mitchell, DG at the Department of International Trade. Rain, over to you.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And welcome back, everyone. I hope you're appropriately refueled with coffee and tea and juice and ready for some more great sessions. I couldn't really tell my children that I was here at the Science Museum, otherwise they would have been totally jealous. So I'm going to have to keep that secret, so if you could all join me in that, much appreciated. And I think, look, this morning we've heard a lot about, green growth and the opportunity it can provide for the UK, but I think we all know that carbon knows no borders, and we can only really tackle climate change if we have global action. And I think now is such an important time because we're actually just over halfway through the UK's presidency of COP26. And in Glasgow we saw, over 90% of the world's economy is now covered by net zero targets, and that was a huge step forward. But I think we're also aware that we really need to see action to deliver that. And yet the world economy is still recovering from the pandemic. The lockdowns in China are lifting, which is obviously a relief for many there, but we're still seeing the impact on supply chains. And I think over the past few years, we've all learned so much about supply chain resilience. And of course, we've seen the devastating war in the Ukraine, which has put a focus on energy security. But I think as Tony started off today, the businesses that I speak to in the UK have really almost used this opportunity to renew the focus on energy efficiency and renewable energy and the transition to net zero. But we really need to see business and international trade and international investment working together to meet this, or it's not going to happen. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two experts who can really help us to understand a bit more about the international transition, the role of trade, the role of supply chain resilience, and some of the global opportunities from green growth. So Andrew, Director General of Exports at UK Trade at DIT, the Department for International Trade. I wonder if we could just sort of start with you. I mean, obviously a huge experience as a trade commissioner and ambassador and in your current role. How important is the sort of green transition to the UK's overall export strategy, and what's the role of your department in delivering that?
Thanks very much indeed, Rain. And you finished really by talking about the opportunity, and as the Trade Department, we absolutely focus on that as, in a sense, the imperative for the department's work. When you think about the work of the Department for International Trade, fundamentally, we focus on four things. We negotiate trade agreements, we look to bring investors to the United Kingdom, we support exporters, and we ensure the integrity of the global trading system. From the government's perspective, of course, the green transition is fundamentally about the continued security and prosperity of the planet that we all share. But the opportunity is also enormous for UK business. So the green economy in the UK is projected to grow by 11% out to 2030, and by 2050, 1.2 million people in the United Kingdom will be employed in low carbon goods and services sectors, and that's a six-fold increase on today. At the same time, the global market for low carbon exports growing rapidly. 2030, this is expected to reach £2 trillion, which could generate £170 billion worth of UK exports. So, frankly, this transition is critical to our prosperity over the medium term, and ensuring that we've got the companies, the capabilities, the trading environment that supports that transition and enables companies to thrive. That's the business of the department that I work for.
Excellent. And Andrew, I guess if I'm a sort of business in the room and, you know, I'm leading sort of investment in a green technology, and maybe I'm manufacturing that here in the UK, but I'm keen to think about how I, you know, bring that to some global markets. What's the best way of sort of working with your department to sort of help make that happen? How do I take those first steps?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the Department for International Trade exists to support exporters exporting, amongst those other roles that I described. We published an export strategy in November of last year. Alongside that, a major new campaign, Made in the UK, Sold to the World, to support exporters looking for new markets around the world. At the same time, we established an export support service. You can find us online. We're extending that export service from markets within Europe, so supporting exporters looking for opportunities within Europe to the rest of the world over the course of the remainder of this year. And embedded within that export strategy, within that export support service, which will be a single global export support service for all UK exporters, there is a new export academy which provides really practical tools for companies looking to export, to explore new markets, with very specific modules within the academy for green exports and export of green goods. So we are really keen to make sure that we capture the opportunity associated with exports, and also that we provide that gap in the market that we think currently exists, helping smaller businesses in particular to develop the skills, the capabilities, but also to access the practical support to get into new markets.
Yeah, really interesting, and obviously as CBI, you know, keen to work with your department on facilitating that. I guess one of the questions, almost sort of stepping back and thinking about the role of trade and globalization in our transition. And actually I have to say I was trying to explain this to my 14-year-old who'd been asked to look at globalization. But how do you see trade? You know, sometimes people can sort of say, well, trade is actually, you know, can be counter to our net zero transition. How would you argue back against that? And how do you see the role of trade agreements in particular on really facilitating that green transition?
I mean, I think we all have an interest in a properly functioning global trading system, don't we? And the integrity of that trading system is fundamental to opening markets for the kinds of companies that are represented here today. I said before, we attract investment and we look to work with global investors to bring them into this country, because we know that, Ora from British Volt is a very good example of this, and spoke really clearly, I thought, about the reasons why it makes sense to invest in the United Kingdom. Creating the environment in which investors can invest is step one, and step two is helping then to work to build supply chains around those investments. And we and BEIS work together. We have a task force very particularly on green supply chain around those major investments. Then, frankly, to open up export markets globally to allow those companies and the supply chain that learns the skills, develops the capabilities, that has those world-leading innovative technologies and services that can then form the export market of tomorrow and the exporting cadre of tomorrow for the UK. I mean, on trade policy very particularly, I mean, I think it's perhaps less well known how important negotiating trade agreements really is in that particular context. For example, we have instituted UK global tariff reductions, Green 100 we call this. This is UK's global tariff regime, removing tariffs on 104 environmental goods as part of that Green 100 initiative. So reducing tariffs on these goods is helping to promote the deployment of renewable energy generation, also focus very particularly on energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage. That was a big theme again of the previous discussion. FTAs, free trade agreements, also play a big role here. So bilateral free trade agreements that we're negotiating with our partners around the world. The recent concluded negotiation with New Zealand includes the most comprehensive list of environmental goods with liberalised tariffs to date, and goes well beyond precedents elsewhere in a number of areas, including fossil fuels, fisheries, and also includes commitments on a wide range of issues such as deforestation. This is how you work together using trade agreements as the spur, sustainable agriculture, marine litter, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we can't think of any, there's so many examples, whether it's an air source heat pump or an electric vehicle or a wind turbine. None of those can, obviously some of that manufacture happens here in the UK, but all of those supply chains touch global supply chains, and trade agreements are obviously a way in which we facilitate some of that. Thomas, I wonder if we might come to you. We talked a little bit about exports and the role of that, but we know that investment is such an important part of the overall strategy, both investment into the UK, but of course investment in countries around the world in their own transition. And you're a partner at 18 East, which provides some of the finance for projects in developing countries to help them with the transition and also improve living standards. And I know you also play a role in the FCDO's program on Mobilist. I wonder if you could just explain a bit more about what that program is and how it helps the UK and our international net zero transition.
Certainly, I shall try. So thank you very much for the introduction. Now, I'm at a strong disadvantage to Andrew when it comes to describing, let alone understanding, government policy, but I'll try and explain where Mobilist fits. And at the simplest level, Mobilist is designed to help private sector businesses, projects, funds to list on major stock exchanges across the world if they are aligned with the UK government's objectives in terms of sustainable development and in terms of the green transition. So it's very much a catalytic program that is targeted at the private sector. And to take a step back, as part of the strategy for international development, the new strategy, the UK government has set a number of priorities, and Mobilist sits at the intersection of two of these. Number one is deliver honest and reliable investment. Number two is taking forward the UK government's work in terms of climate change, amongst other key global themes. And a big part of the strategy is around investment, and particularly British investment partnerships. And within that, there's a development finance pillar, and that's solely targeted at the private sector. So it's not focused on lending to governments, but to financing private sector enterprises, projects, etc. And there are three components to this. The first one is BII, so British International Investment, which used to be known as CDC, which is the British Development Finance Institution. The second one is the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which invests again in private sector infrastructure projects across emerging markets. And the third one is Mobilist. So a couple of characteristics. So Mobilist is focused on the private sector, and it's focused on mobilization. Why? Because the realization over the last decade has been that the public funding available to development finance institutions pales in comparison to the needs of associated with the challenges of sustainable development and indeed the green transition. So it's necessary to mobilize private capital to invest in private projects to deliver on these objectives. So that's the MOBI part of Mobilist. The LIST part comes from a very unique feature of the Mobilist program, and that's its focus on public capital markets. Now, historically, as some of you may know, development finance has really focused on private asset models and direct lending, so private equity, private debt, or just lending from its own balance sheet. And if you take a step back, if you add up all the listed bonds and all the listed shares in the world and all of the assets of private equity or private debt funds, public markets account for 95% of that, and yet the focus of development finance mobilization to date has largely been on the private asset side. So we've been trying to solve the world's largest problems with the world's smallest pocket, if you want. And Mobilist is a really pioneering initiative on the part of the UK government and on the part of FCDO to address that misalignment, if you want, and to bridge that gap. And there are a number of ways that we can help private sector players to get to public markets, to mobilize additional and new sources of capital. Obviously, I'd be very happy to discuss these in more detail if you see fit.
Absolutely, Thomas. I wonder if you could bring, one of that to life. Is there a particular project where you've seen a sort of listing that really has helped to get some of that private capital into a developing country? or here in the UK?
Certainly, and if I may, I'll also tie that into how the UK can play a very specific role in what is a global endeavour. In particular, one of the stipulations of the strategy is that we should deliver honest and reliable investments by building on the financial expertise of the UK and the strength of the City of London. And one particular very successful precedent has been set in the UK. So since 2013, there's a thriving investment trust sector on the London Stock Exchange that is solely focused on renewable energy assets. It was started by the IPO of something called Greencoat UK Wind in 2013. That was done with the help of what was at the time BIS, so with an investment from the UK government, and that has grown continuously and continues to grow to a sector that has well over 15 different funds and assets in excess of 16 billion pounds. And that's giving liquid, regulated access to investors to long-term, illiquid, renewable energy assets. And that's a model that we think the UK can and indeed should export. So the first thing that Mobilis did in terms of investment is support the IPO of such an investment trust last December, but it happened to be the first one ever giving access to renewable energy assets in developing countries, in that particular case in India and in the Philippines. And we look forward to creating more precedents like this that can be scaled through the market. So as you can imagine, a sector like this needs the support of financial intermediaries and a number of other service providers that are UK based, that they can export their expertise to help create such sectors further afield. But beyond that, of course, the operators of these assets, the technology providers, can also export their know-how. And we certainly are aware of the immense needs in terms of infrastructure in developing countries. And we do believe that the British industry has a great role to play, which in turn can be supported financially by initiatives such as Mobilis.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds fascinating, and as you say, there's just so much opportunity. We know in the UK we need £50 billion of investment per year to help our net zero transition, but the needs across developing countries are even greater. But that provides an opportunity for us to make some of those investments and help to unlock some of that private capital.
Indeed, that the UK can benefit on both sides of the equation. I mean, it is obviously a major centre in terms of institutional investor capital, in terms of industry, financial industry services, and in terms of technology and the management of renewable energy assets or other aspects of the green transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm keen to open up to the audience in just one moment, but before I do, I wonder if I could ask a sort of question to both of you, sort of briefly in turn. Obviously, the past couple of years have been hugely challenging. We've seen the COVID pandemic and a war now in Europe. How has those sort of experiences almost changed things for you, and how has it helped to? Are you more optimistic about the scope for international collaboration and what exports or investment can do around our net zero transition? Andrew, maybe you first.
So I'd say, first thing I'd say is that clearly you can see the impact of closure, reopening in the context of pressures on supply chains in particular, and that this has provoked a set of challenges alongside inflation in the global economy that we really haven't had to manage in quite this way previously. You see the impact of that on trade. I mean, I think the second thing I'd say is that against that, the world recognises, and I think it's one of the conclusions that you have to draw from the COVID crisis, that fundamentally we are connected, and that we're connected when the problem happens. We need to be connected as well when the solution emerges. My own sense of this from the extensive contacts that we have as a department with business is that as we are re-emerging and as we are opening up again, that sort of sense of the imperative of the net zero transition is very strongly held around the world. And I think that as the global economy normalizes again, if we can manage those inflationary challenges, I think the opportunities are going to be absolutely, they're going to be huge. We have to stick to it though, and I think also we've got to ensure, and it was a theme of a previous discussion that we heard this morning, that we get the policy and the regulation right also in terms of the domestic environment. To Thomas's example, I mean, the G7 summit, Carbis Bay, Prime Minister's championing of the Clean Green Initiative investment in those economies around the world is also about mobilising opportunities for UK private actors to help countries around the world to affect that green transition, because we know it has to be global. So, you know, the other the sort of final point about this from my perspective is that there are certain elements of market failure that exist out there, and Thomas described how Mobilist plays a role in all of that. We've also got to have that perspective very much in mind. We'll only achieve this if we address those collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Thomas, any of your reflections?
Yes, I mean, so the main challenge we are facing at this point in time, this is about investing in emerging markets. And traditionally, whenever there is a crisis, capital has a very strong tendency to come home and to shy away from greener pastures elsewhere. So we have to convince that there is a real opportunity there. And we do believe that it is somewhat easier because there is a real understanding of how global the green transition needs to be effective on one side, and second, because we have readily understandable business models to offer in this particular context. So yes, it is in a different climate, but it is a business model, a financial model that investors can readily understand because they are doing it already in a developed country context. And I guess a message for your members is also that what we can provide through Mobilist and through the rest of the development finance system in the UK is assistance in going there, is support in terms of capital, in terms of what we call technical assistance funding, so helping learn lessons, if you like, and in terms of creating precedents that are observable and that people can take comfort from.
If I may, just one final point on that, which is that just to add to the suite of products and services available, UK Export Finance, we are hugely proud of the export finance capability that we have, world-leading, major transition out of fossil fuels, now £2 billion worth of direct lending available to green goods and services, a part of that suite of offer from the government that is about helping businesses to get into developing markets in particular to help to affect that green transition.
Absolutely. So I think it's collaboration, even as things improve, and not retreating from some of the opportunities in emerging markets, as even in times of crisis. So keen to kind of bring in some questions from the audience in the moments we have left. I'm looking for some hands. I'll go to the gentleman in the white, just in the middle there. I saw your hand first. I'll do my best to bring in as many questions, and maybe then this one there.
Thank you. Dirk Campbell from the Money Rebellion Talk Team. It's a question for Andrew Hayne. Transport is highly energy intensive, about 30% of global CO2 emissions currently. Have you factored in this energy cost into your trade equations, particularly as we are no longer exporting to the EU, but much further afield?
I guess maybe what I'll do is group a couple of questions, but yeah, I think a really good question about how we think about transport costs and the emissions within that in our trade agreements.
Morning, Adam Geefke, Energy Intensive Users Group. Should UK international trade policy take into account the risk of carbon leakage? And I'm thinking, for example, of carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
Excellent. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms, I have to say, even as an economist, I know these are hugely complicated, but quite important for us to think about, not just our emissions in the UK, but also globally, and how we have a level playing field when it comes to emissions. Andrew, I'll let you tackle those questions, and we'll see, Thomas, if you have any reflections.
So the first one first. From my perspective, the challenges are connected, are they not? I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, if you're travelling further afield, then you're expending more carbon, naturally enough. But the challenge that we all have is to decarbonise transport. And part of that solution is also about the innovative technologies that we are developing ourselves here, that we will want to export, that will help to contribute to that challenge. And maybe that is a slightly medium term rather than a short term perspective, but nonetheless that has to be part of the solution. I think the other thing I would say about this is that there is never, I think, a world in which you're not always, as a business, thinking about the relationship between your pressures on your supply chain, how you source, and what the best value for your customer ultimately will be in the way that you think about this. And what, when I led a piece of work during COVID, which looked at our global supply chains, and I think, if you look at global supply chains today versus 2 years ago in certain critical areas in particular, you can see quite big changes, and those changes are associated with the fact that broadly the world understands that diversification of supply, not putting everything domestically, not nearshoring everything, not farshoring everything, but having genuine diversification in supply chains is a really critical part of the answer to the problem. Do you want me to?
I think that's great. Maybe what I'll do is just bring in see if I can bring in one more question before we I wrap up. I see someone with their hand at the back.
Thank you. Adam Williamson from the Association of Accounting Technicians. You've talked about investment. Clearly the investment is only any good if it goes to the right places. So I wonder what your thoughts are around how we get comparability globally of measurement and reporting, and making sure that money is actually doing what it needs to be doing with the right people.
Thomas, I think great question for you, just thinking about the investment flows and how we have the right reporting standards.
Indeed, and I'll try and look in your general direction, but just know that I am completely blinded by
I know, it is a bit blinded by the light.
But so one advantage of this initiative coming from the development finance sector is that development finance institutions, whether they be multilateral or bilateral, have spent a lot of time building standards and understanding how to deliver exactly what you say. How do we compare projects in South Asia and in Latin America against impact credentials? So one thing that we do insist on is that any project that we do fund adopts, for example, the IFC performance standards or an equivalent, which again does allow us, but far more importantly allows the market to start thinking in the terms that you suggest. Where is the impact created and how does it compare to another project that might provide me with the same financial return but not necessarily with the same impact on the green transition process?
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, did you want to add anything?
I mean, just on that, I suppose if I could be selfish for a moment, of course I represent the department that thinks about that problem from a slightly different perspective, in the sense that we're trying to attract investors to the United Kingdom. And in this very room, October of last year, we hosted the Global Green Investment Conference. In fact, I've still got PTSD from the experience of trying to get VVIPs up in those lifts, but let's leave that aside for one moment. But that is absolutely an effort to ensure that we create the best possible environment for investment here in the United Kingdom as well. And other speakers earlier on today have spoken about the importance of the quality of the investment environment from the perspective of incentive, regulation, policy, but also how clusters operate, how you create the ecosystem around investment, and how you maximize also and work to your strengths. And there's a geographical strengths and certain capabilities in different parts of the country. And I thought that was a very interesting discussion this morning. Certainly, if you look at that question from the perspective of how do we make sure that we attract the best quality investment into the right places in the United Kingdom, you have to have a view on local strengths, on how clusters operate, on how to create an ecosystem and incentives more broadly. We will in fact be hosting, if I can allow another plug, Northern Green Trade Investment Expo as a bridge from the Global Investment Summit to the next version of that at some point in the northeast of England in the autumn time. And again, we think that there is a real role, as there is this conference today, bringing policymakers, investors, and everybody from the financial, professional, business community together to think about these challenges and also to help us to improve that domestic environment.
Excellent. So look, I think we've really heard from you, Andrew, the sort of role that trade can play in facilitating our international transition. And I think, Thomas, just the role of private capital can really help, in particularly in listing in public markets and really unlocking some of that money into renewable energy and emerging markets, and just how much potential there is there. Though I think, as we know, it's not without its challenges. We need to have the right standards around investment reporting. I think that question was also a perfect plug for a session we'll have later this afternoon, which I'll also be leading around green finance. So a good question to return to. And I think really important questions as well about how we make sure our transportation, we lower emissions as we go. And, in the UK with Jet Zero, and how I think the aviation community has come together to really help to get some of the sustainable aviation fuels off the ground, pardon that terrible pun, is so important. And the same goes for hydrogen and other technologies in shipping. And we do need to have the right carbon pricing, I think, to make that work fairly across countries, and the carbon border adjustment is part of that. We can maybe have a side conversation on that. So thank you, all of you. A big thank you to my guests, to Andrew and Thomas. Really great to have you both, and I will pass over to Matthew to take us on to the next session.
Well, look, Rain, Thomas, Andrew, thank you for that absolutely brilliant piece. Those of you who listened intently to that session will know that Rain is not just our chief economist, but also our green conscience, our green champion, but is absolutely not in charge of the jokes. So, Rain, you're off duty on dad jokes. That's not allowed. Look, we're closing in on part way through day one, so we've got one more session coming up right now, just before lunch. And actually, for this session, we're going to throw a little bit of grit into the oyster, because so far this morning we've been talking all about the opportunities that are out there, and of course there are plenty, but also that it's not without its challenges. So our next session, Realising Net Zero, the scale of the challenge facing business. We know last year we made significant strides forward, but we've got now confronting the headwinds of the cost of living challenges, the energy crisis, inflation. How can we ensure that net zero stays right at the heart of that business agenda? And also, how do we then get into turning some of those net zero ideas into reality, and the action that will follow from COP26 as we head into the sort of hard yards of delivery? So put bluntly, for this next session, do our panelists think that business is doing enough? And how can business step up to support not just their employees, but the wider community too? So we've got a great lineup to debate these many challenges over the next 45 minutes. And of course, plenty of opportunity for you to put your questions to them. So as we've been doing so far, when we get to that point in the debate, please do raise your hand. Someone will get to you with a number and a microphone, and there will be opportunities to pitch in with your questions. So I've just seen them coming into the room now. So in a moment, please join me in welcoming. We've got Faisal Islam, the economics editor from BBC News, and joining Faisal on the panel, we're going to be hearing from Tanya Steele, the Chief Executive of WWF, Dr. Thomas Hale from the University of Oxford, Chris Stark from the Committee on Climate Change, and Sasha Wright from the Force of Nature. So as we get the microphones lined up in just a moment, bear with me if you want to check an email or two, and then Faisal and the team will be up here on stage and we'll get stuck into the session before lunch. Faisal, over to you as and when you're ready.
Nice to see you, Tom.
Musical chairs.
Right, hopefully everyone can hear us. We're here for a very important panel, as it says, Realising Net Zero, the scale of the challenge. I know you've been hearing from the great and the good this morning, and as great and as good right now in terms of the challenge. I mean, a couple of quick little anecdotes from me about having reported this over 15, 20 years now. I mean, I was doing a spring clean, found an SD card, old SD card, dangerous thing to put that into the computer and see what comes out. And mine was a load of reports from when I was about 12, working for Channel 4 News about these very issues. And there was an oddly famous interview with an energy boss, probably the company's represented here, I won't mention them by name, where he said, he was trying to get across his idea of energy efficiency and said, a bit like Jimmy Carter, let's wear, maybe we're going to have to wear 2 jumpers, ha ha. And of course this was all over the tabloids and he wasn't really seen in the country again after that comment. But he was making a very serious point. And I was amazed by the actual answer that he gave, because it was, we need to invest in renewables, we need to focus on the infrastructure, we need to obviously help with insulation. And the answer literally could have been exactly the same answer as we've got now 14 years later. And yes, there has been progress. I'm a journalist, I'm a dismal scientist, I look at the negatives. It doesn't seem like there was a huge amount of progress, given where this quote came from 14 years ago from one of our energy leaders. The other little vista that I get from having to film the economy and film this transition is scrambling around the Isle of Grain, trying to get a view on the platform where a tanker was coming in, having done a U-turn near Hawaii, heading to China with frozen liquefied gas, if that is a physics concept that actually is a real one, and had come back through the Suez Canal and ended up unloading a third of our daily winter's supply of gas into the UK network. And I was thinking, how does this work? How does it work? They freeze it and it comes here. And climate change, and I'm not sure. And okay, all right, then there are dozens of these ships, record numbers of these ships coming, and it's all fine. Or is it fine? Or is this a symbol, in fact, of the challenge of the reality? I'm going to put this to this great panel, that the current crisis, the daily crisis, the day-to-day crisis, we're told that the climate crisis is the #1 crisis, but the revealed preference and the reality we've seen politically over the past 3 months, 6 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, 3 hours, has been that people feel an energy crisis more. And has that changed the political economy even since the COP26 of last autumn? Anyway, that's my little intro. We have a great panel here. We have Thomas Hale, who's the Associate Professor of Global Public Policy at Blavatnik, Oxford. Chris Stark, who's the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. And we have Tanya Steele, who's the Chief Exec of WWF, as you know, and Sasha Wright here, who is the Research and Curriculum Coordinator for Force of Nature, which is a youth charity around climate. So let me open up. Are businesses doing enough when it comes to the climate change and resilience? Now, those are not necessarily the same things, but why don't I start with you on this issue?
I think that there's no doubt that businesses are making some very big strides forward, and we saw this ahead of the climate meeting, ahead of COP26. I guess there's a question in terms of, are businesses going far enough? What we saw was and have seen has been a flurry of commitments, and there was a piece of research we did as WWF just running into the big COP26 meeting. And I guess the worrying thing that we saw, whilst there were great commitments, less than half of those businesses had publicly available net zero plans. And this is for some of the biggest companies in the UK. So while we're seeing the commitments, we're seeing the interest, actually, is there enough of a shift into the implementation and ultimately the action as well? So, I think we're in the balance a little bit, and it won't surprise you that an organisation like WWF will probably say a couple of things. First of all, we really do need businesses to go further and faster. I think the other thing that I would say, though, is that businesses do think long term, and you do reach into your supply chains, you reach into your business models. I think you are very, very, very well equipped to start to take on this issue, not just for this year, but actually for many years to come as well.
Okay. What's the Climate Change Committee?
Well,
you've got a number of analyses and pathways.
Yeah, so we've looked at a load.
Are we still on the path?
We're on a path. Whether it's the right one is much more debatable, sadly. We've got, in this country, a set of targets that I would say are on the right path. They've been agonised over. They are amongst the most ambitious in the world. We are unusual in the UK in having not only targets that are aligned with the right pathway to the Paris targets that
we are a signatory to, but also having a strategy. So you could say that the UK is sort of manoeuvring and putting the pieces in place, but I mean, it's really important. We asked the question about the role of business. Most of the effort that we will need to expend to achieve those targets is going to come through this kind of mixture of policies that drive progress in the private sector, but the reality is the private sector does the work. So it's businesses, it's individuals as well who will make, crucially, the investments that we need to achieve net zero. Apart from a couple of areas, I couldn't say hand on heart that we are really on the right path to achieving those targets when you look at that bit of the bit that really matters in the private sector. The two glimmers are in our power sector, what we see happening with renewables. Huge investment flowing to broadly the right things there now. And interestingly, electric vehicles is the other one I would pick out. Electric cars specifically, vans a bit behind that. But when you look outside of those two shiny bits, we don't really see that the frameworks are in the place that they need to be, the policies are well aligned, and that we're driving that change on the ground that we will need to achieve net zero. So that's going to be the challenge for this decade. There's plenty of time to fix that. Yeah. But the overall challenge, of course, climate challenge, is one that doesn't wait. So it's the thing on the clock is the key thing.
So can you just give us a sense of scale? It's been described that we've done the low-hanging fruit in terms of the energy system, and that's happened sort of so people haven't had to change their lifestyles. But the really tricky stuff is where it does jut up against what people expect, how they live their lives. But what proportion of the journey have we succeeded in, essentially, whilst not affecting anyone's lifestyles, under the covers, behind, in the system, in the plumbing of the energy system?
Well, it depends on your outlook. So we measure everything from 1990. Yeah. And if you look at it on that basis, we're about halfway down the journey that we need to be on to get to the goal of 100% reduction in emissions. Yeah. But that first half, as you say, is probably the easy bit. So it's the stuff that crucially hasn't involved lots of interference. Yeah. Now, there is an outlook, and I think this government has this outlook, that we can go still further on this journey without lots of that kind of interference, and I'm open to that. But the reality is, once you've decarbonised your power sector, and this government has set a goal to do that by 2035, that was our advice, and that's fantastic. That's a really important offer to the people in this country, the businesses operating in this country. We're saying by 2035, whatever electrical device you use will be zero carbon. Once you've done that, you are into the reality of the real economy, the changes that need to take place there. So we're talking about turning over the fleet of vehicles on this road, all the effort that needs to happen in buildings up and down the country, premises for business, places where people live, the reality of the changes that need to happen in land use and agriculture, the change in plant and machinery that needs to happen. That is a big effort which we haven't really scratched the surface of yet. So I would say that is the harder bit. And when you look at it on that basis, it's this decade that will matter. This is the decade where we'll put the policies in place that will guide that investment. Over the 2030s, we'll start to see the emissions reduction.
Okay, the obvious question, which I won't ask now, but you can just ponder, is obviously over the past year, I mean, maybe not so much here, but not, we're hearing about actually extending the life of some of the hydrocarbon, security of supply being very interesting, the consequences of Russia and Ukraine. But we'll come back to that. That's before we bring in both Thomas and Sasha. So Thomas, where do you see businesses' role? I hear about this kind of wall of green cash that's available, that has been achieved by tweaking the banking system. I mean, is that really going to fundamentally change how we meet this challenge?
So I think, as Tanya said, we have a real kind of cognitive dissonance here on are we doing enough? Because on the one hand, we're doing much more than we've ever done in the past. We have this real sense of momentum. But at the same time, we know that it's not enough to achieve what we've said we want to achieve. And that's really hard to hold those two sort of competing ideas in your head at the same time. But we see it very much with businesses and with the mobilization of finance, as you're referring to. So we have a project in Oxford looking at all the Forbes 2000 companies around the world, biggest 2000 publicly listed companies, and we've seen twice as many commit to net zero as did a year ago. So this is huge momentum. But if you drill into the details of that, as Tanya was saying, you find a lot of work to be done. Just to cite one example, of those 700 or so Forbes 2000 companies that are currently committed to net zero, about half have said they're going to rely on offsetting, and the other half haven't said whether or not they're going to rely on offsetting in some way. And of the ones that have, 2/3 of those haven't yet said exactly what they're doing with their offsetting or given any conditions around it. So we have a lot more work to do to figure out what this commitment really means, but it doesn't mean it's not a good direction of travel. It's the only direction of travel, and we need to double down on it. The finance commitments is a big part of that because the finance community has moved much faster. You know, they're really behind the corporates and for this mobilization, developing methodologies, even thinking about this problem in the same way. They've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot to figure out. And this $130 trillion that are the assets under management by something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is the umbrella group for this, now needs to be turned into concrete transition plans, as Tanya said, and into real methodologies for tracking, you know, what does it mean to be a net zero asset manager or a investment consultant, all these different entities. So that's the hard work before us now, and the imperative is to not lose sight of these two kind of ideas, this cognitive dissonance. We're doing a lot more, but we need to now, you know, whenever you win a level in a video game or something, it gets a little bit harder, and that's where we are now.
Okay, let's just unpick some of that because the numbers are massive. And so what does it practically mean when you get a pension company, insurance company, a bank, whatever? Are they seriously having conversations with their kind of carbon intensive customers and saying, do you know what, we actually aren't going to fund that. We really aren't going to fund that. You're going to have to get out of that business, even if it appears to be their only business. Are those conversations really happening? Does this mechanism of using the lever of big finance really work?
So I think we see a lot of diversity in how much those conversations are happening, and absolutely many are. So there's some very large financial entities that are really taking a quite, I would say, radical position on these things and driving real transformation, particularly some of the asset owners, some of the insurance companies. Others, I think, are still in the realm of thinking this is going to be some kind of accounting game where you can really kind of figure out a clever way to brand something as ESG and therefore get the activists off your back. And I think what they're now realizing is that's not the case. This is really about building credibility and trust, and the only way to do that is to really walk the talk. And that's where the kind of messy part we're in now. But it's on the numbers. You know, the Glasgow Financial Alliance and Net Zero GFAN's kind of commitment is to require transition plans of all the companies in which they invest, in which they facilitate. And if they really do, which by the way aligns with the incoming regulation we're seeing on transition plans, that could be really decisive.
So to be clear, it's the banks and the asset managers and big finance here, that each of the customers to which they provide funds will also have to have transition plans.
That's the requirement, yeah.
And that hasn't happened yet.
That is the
happening.
ask. That is the ask.
Okay, all right, well, fascinating stuff. Do you think that this is functioning, this is working, that business is doing enough? Is it greenwash? I mean...
Well, that's a big question. I mean, as you said, there's only one direction that we can really be moving in. But I don't think there's any hope in another 10 years of incrementalism, even in another 5 years of incrementalism. If we continue with business as usual, if none of the policies change, then we're looking at 3.2 degrees Celsius of warming. And we've had the technology, the ingenuity, the resources, if not to stop, at least stem the climate crisis for generations before I was born. And what we've fundamentally lacked is the willingness. And we look at, conferences like the COP conference, and they're these sorts of shows of pageantry, and you meet business leaders or government leaders who are fluent in greenwash. And I think when I see that, you're leaving behind a great deal of the world that is vulnerable currently to the climate crisis, but you're also leaving behind your own citizens and your own employees. You mentioned something really interesting, and it was this idea of trust. At this point, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when businesses need to change. And I think that businesses need to do three things in order to really reestablish that trust, both with their consumers, but also with their own employees. And the first is they need to tap into the talent and the ingenuity that actually exists within their companies. Something that we do at Force of Nature is we run these surveys when we go in to engage with businesses to really dig into the psychology of the employees. And oftentimes, it's these companies that have made these big commitments, these big net zero strategies, and their own employees don't have the trust in those leaders to take them in that direction. There's been no involvement, and it comes down from the top tier of leadership. But actually, the working class, those who have so often been left out of the conversation in terms of environmentalism, are those who are going to be vulnerable to the transition if it's not just. The second thing is that DNA needs to be baked into the sustainability needs to be baked into the DNA of companies, because if we see it as a tick boxing activity, as something that's ornamental, as something that's being added on, it's going to add more to employees' plates. And additionally, we don't need more sustainable products. We need to make the products that we already have more sustainable. And finally, we need to fundamentally change the goalposts of business and say, okay, rather than being driven by this idea of how can we, increase our fluency in greenwash, how can we create a new marketing campaign, rather, really, how can we change our idea of profit within the company and take our employees on that journey with us?
Okay, but whatever Thomas has told us about the changing of the financial wiring, plumbing of the entire world, I mean, some of the concepts that you're suggesting there, and I've got my iPad and my iPhone here, I mean, you're effectively fundamentally changing consumer model of much of global capitalism. Don't bring out. Is that what you're saying? What are you suggesting to these representatives of business here in terms of, someone that runs a consumer company that brings out a new model of, I don't know, washing machine or every year, or in that cycle of buying new things and new. Are you saying that that's broken and can't be fixed? Yeah, okay.
I'm not saying it can't be fixed, absolutely not.
How do you fix it then?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Yeah. And that's what I would pose to companies and what I would pose to them to ask to their employees as well, and to take them on that journey. When you're looking at FMCGs that are having pressure placed on them to be more sustainable, you're seeing them putting out new lines of shoes or new washing products that have 30% sustainable material. Then when you ask them what the projected growth for that item is, it's 200%. And it's it doesn't help to do more kind of poorly. It helps to look back at the DNA of your company and say, what can we do internally?
Just give us an example of someone that's done this well without doing an advert.
That's a big question. I would say an ad that I actually saw recently that made me think about this was by Veja, the shoe company. I think I see you wearing Vejas.
I do.
And I'm not. I'm not saying that they're doing.
Other trainers are available.
I'm not saying that they're doing it perfectly, but their most recent ad campaign around sustainability was the most sustainable sneakers are the ones that you already own. Okay. So when you look at companies, this was a provocation that we posed to Nike as well. When you look at companies, rather than saying how can we release more sustainable shoes, rather how could you make your shoes modular? How could you make them so that they could be recycled or upscaled or cleaned or kind of updated, rather than releasing new products in a really unsustainable manner?
Okay, is that realistic?
I think that's a very important part of the transition. I think that there's a lot of importance also in broadening the scope to look beyond the sort of consumer goods and think about the transformations of the hard-to-abate sectors in the industry. And that's where we do need really radical transformation. We have some really exciting models in shipping and steel, and as we were hearing in the previous panel, some ideas, but more work to do, I'd say, on aviation and other places like that. And if we can just think about the problem of being broken down into these different sectors, we have actually a lot more, I think, granularity to be able to make these kinds of changes. So consumers and employees are an important part of the equation, but there's real kind of innovation space to be done on the hard-to-abate sectors.
So let's go back to some. Sorry, cool.
Could I come in on that actually? Because I think what's important is this is potentially going to be a huge trickle-down effect. I know we were joking about trainers, and I promise you we're not on commission here. But actually some of the biggest companies now are looking at this in the round. It's not sort of a niche concern. And I know we've talked about the fact that sort of green funds shouldn't be this little thing off the side. And I'm just thinking about some work a number of us are doing with 5 of the UK's largest food retailers, who made a commitment to halve the environmental impact of the average UK weekly shop. That's both the climate impact, but also the nature impact. And when you start to look at that across the sheer scale, that's 50% of all the food that we buy in our supermarkets every single day. You start to look at the packaging, you start to look at some of the food components, the transportation, etc. So businesses like that are already saying we can see the climate crisis, we can see our supply chains are in trouble in terms of where we source bananas, coffee or anything else. Actually, let's set some targets and let's set sail now in terms of how we drive this change, but also how they work themselves with their own supply chain to enable them to both be successful in it, but to make that transition too. So it's starting to come.
Okay, well, this gets us into some interesting territory because we talked about this low-hanging fruit. We talked about the political difficulties of telling not just sort of, telling the mass of consumers, all consumers, you've got to change your habits. Is that what we're saying?
I don't think it is actually.
We're not. We're saying
it's not. If that's all it is, then we're not going to be successful.
Some habits. Then.
I think that's correct. I think
okay.
it's really important to say that our consumption choices ultimately are what matters here. I mean, the target that we're talking about today at this conference is net zero, and in effect, that's a consumption target. Yeah. It's about, principally the fossil fuels.
It fundamentally requires less consumption, though, doesn't it?
Well, there are situations where you can screw your eyes up a bit and see world where that doesn't happen. But it's not the world that I see when we look at the analysis that we've done. You fundamentally have to be more resource efficient, and you need to look at some of the concepts that I'm sure we're talking about at this conference, like the circular economy, if you want to be successful in net zero. Or you need to do it in a very wasteful way. That's not the way that anyone would want to see this target achieved.
I mean, there was that very interesting, around COP26, the government commissioned the nudge units to bring out a report, which it was nudge. It seemed like quite a hard nudge around discouraging certain types of business travel, and there's some interesting language on the eating meat. Got buried by the government, right?
Yeah.
And then miraculously released for everyone to read. It was a very interesting read, but isn't that the reality? The reality. This is obviously a global issue, but the reality here is that even that nudge of why didn't you think about meat consumption or something like that was too politically hot for a government to even think about releasing.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyone.
I think I've seen that report, and in fact, we borrowed from it in some of the work that we've done. We'd seen pre-drafts of it, and to my mind, that was a pretty tame report. It had a set of things in it that were about a set of very positive choices, actually, that face people, consumers.
Yeah.
But this is a government that doesn't want to talk about those things. And you can see that the strategy for net zero that we have, which is great to have. It's fantastic to have a strategy like that. I don't think there's anything like it when you look around the world for an economy the size of the UK's. But it doesn't touch the demand stuff. It's very clearly, it's an explicit choice of this government to look at it in that way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take us into, one of the things that Tony talked about earlier, the need to address energy demand. It doesn't take us into some of the positive choices that lie ahead with healthy diets, for example. It certainly doesn't address some of the harder stuff on aviation, for example. Yeah. We would say, in our analysis, you're just making the problem harder. These are progressive choices that mostly in the country people are ready to make. The size of the problem doesn't get any smaller unless you take those choices. And for us, in our work, that has consistently felt like a gap in the government strategy.
So, that's the tough stuff. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. What should be really easy and kind of obvious? Insulation creates jobs, increases the quality of people's lived environments, uses less energy. In this country, at least, every single scheme seems to end in failure. What's going on there? Is anyone got any ideas as to why?
I don't think it's difficult. Is it something
functional and structurally wrong?
Well, we produced probably one of the most republished charts we've ever produced, which was a kind of a last-minute thing that we looked at, which was looking at very simple representation of how many measures were installed in homes to do home insulation. And you see this very clear story playing out. So when we had DEC doing the policy on energy, strong support for home insulation, actually, and millions of measures happening in the country. So you hit millions of installations.
So people want it, tick.
That's done. Then that support pulled away.
Oh, okay.
Plummets to close to zero.
Okay.
And you get this kind of, the really interesting thing is not so much the fact that the policy was pulled away and you see home insulation measures drop. That's kind of obvious. It's the damage that has been done to general confidence for the people who would be in the supply chain for delivering those measures.
I see. So you create the industry.
You create this industry,
training,
you warm people up, you ginger up the interest in it, and then you pull the rug away. And actually that is doubly difficult to address now. So we know we need to address this. We've got to be much better insulated as a country. It makes sense for all sorts of reasons. You see why right now, with energy costs as high as they are, I guarantee you will see reduced energy demand right now, but this is not the way to do it. We should have done more on this. Building that back up is principally, I would say, a challenge of rebuilding confidence in those supply chains, because if we don't do that, it's going to be extremely difficult to address the challenge for buildings.
Someone put it to me that of the many billions of pounds that have, being spent subsidising bills right now, X billion is being spent literally heating people's streets.
Yeah.
It's going out into the air because our homes are so badly insulated. Anyway, maybe come up with a number.
Beautifully put. Yeah, I mean, I haven't got the number, but it's a very high number.
It will be in the billions.
Our buildings to cool down. It's only a question of how quickly they cool down.
Okay, well, that brings us on to the... Okay, I'm going to be provocative to all four of you now, right? Okay, reality check here. In autumn, the climate crisis is the biggest crisis. We were told by campaigners, the reality in every country in the world in the past 2 months has been leaders of democracies and dictatorships and everything. It's the energy crisis that's the biggest crisis for them. And in terms of the financing, people are telling me, the banks are not financing carbon, but now the private equity guys have just got to come in with money they've borrowed from the same banks, and they're now funding the same hydrocarbons because publics want cheaper energy. Answer me that riddle.
I think we make a category mistake when we say it's sort of an energy crisis or a climate crisis, or it's a food crisis or a security crisis or a climate crisis. There's no way to separate these things, right? This is about different causal factors that combine into a systematic way. And the climate crisis is going to be with us for 100 years. It's going to manifest in lots of ways. And the way it's currently manifesting is in an acute energy shock, which comes from a geopolitical event combined with our dependence on a volatile commodity. 2 volatile commodities, to be precise. And that's not going to go away until we actually make a transition to a different kind of energy source. So I think we're obviously going to see diverse effects in different countries. As you can probably hear, I come from the United States. There, the energy shock is really having a negative consequence for energy transition in that it's giving a new lease on life to some of the frackers and things. But in Europe, it's having the exact opposite effect, right? It's driving greater energy efficiency. It's driving an acceleration of the move away from fossil fuels. And I think that's the tendency that we need to build on.
Well, that was what struck me, standing on this mound in Kent, seeing this tanker coming in from the States, where you're hearing, Joe Biden comes in, rejoins Paris, and I'm like, hang on, he's sending all his fracked gas to Europe now. How does that work? How does it work?
So there are contradictions between shorter term and medium term, and I think that's particularly true in large exporters of hydrocarbons, as the United States now is. However, we just saw yesterday the Biden administration do something really extraordinary. They used their executive authority to activate a World War II era industrial policy power to take away and prevent tariffs on solar panels coming from China. Right? So this is where there's been a decisive move. We need energy security. Okay. We have competition with China, but we're actually going to prioritize the climate goal here and the energy security goal to get the solar panels built, because that's going to help us in the longer term to compete with the geopolitical contest that we have going on.
So this is for you. This is quite a critical moment now, where I guess I'm not saying that they're separate crises. I'm just suggesting that when push comes to shove, as it spectacularly has done over the past 2 or 3 months, and people make choices, it turns out, to some degree, we can argue about how much, politicians are responding to people wanting to pay their bills and are subsidising. One of the great asks of the climate movement was, stop subsidising hydrocarbons. We've got even more subsidies of hydrocarbon right now, but that's a natural response to people who might freeze in their homes.
I completely agree. I think we're going to, of course, have for the next 100 years this difficult problem of short-term imperatives coming in the way of our longer-term objectives. We saw this in COVID. We saw this, many times. We'll see it throughout the process. But the realization is that climate change, this is the cognitive shift we need to take on. This is not some sort of long-term altruistic thing for other people. This is about immediate benefit for us here and now. That's what the energy crisis is telling us. The climate crisis is one about getting our protection, getting our safety, getting access to energy for the people in this country and other countries right in this immediate moment. So I think, we're not going to get around the long-term versus short-term. We need to get better at that, but it's going to be a persistent dynamic. But that doesn't mean the climate is always going to be deprioritized. It's being prioritized now for energy security reasons.
Do you do you want to come in on that? As a campaigning issue, I guess, are you finding it, given the energy, it's a tricky one, isn't it? You could persuade everybody right now, yeah, we should have gone hell for leather on renewables and green, and then we wouldn't be in such trouble. But the reality right now is the governments are responding by reopening some coal mines, by pumping more gas.
Well, it's a really interesting point, and I'm from Alberta in Canada, which is the home of the oil sands, and so for me it was, to use your term, cognitive dissonance, moving into a space where actually those who sat in that industry, who had been born onto that geography, had inherited that economy, were the ones who were being shamed for using it and kind of sitting in those systems. And I think that what we need to do is we need to shift our sight from either systemic change or consumer change or individual change to more collective action. You know, you look at something like carbon footprinting, and placing the onus on the individual was something that was created by the hydrocarbon industry in the 80s to really shuffle that responsibility off of themselves. And you're absolutely right, it's not fair to look at individuals in their homes who are freezing and saying, you really shouldn't be using that form of energy. That's not, ethical, that's not moral. Who would I be on my high horse, sanctimonious, if I'm looking at people and saying that? But you're absolutely right. You know, the climate crisis and climate issues are also issues of social justice, they're issues of women's rights, they're issues of food systems, and we need to see how we can fundamentally bring it back to the base of that and put people at the center. And that's where the responsibility of governments come in, and governments to work with businesses as well. You see in some businesses, they have these net zero strategies, and then they're actively sending lobbyists into government to lobby against the policies that would enact those. And so I think we need a coordinated collective effort that really places that, climate and social justice at the forefront.
You were talking about the food strategy and how the food crisis and how that feeds into this. And I want to take some questions too, but I can't see any hands. Anybody? Okay, fine. Let's.
I think we're rightly talking about the energy crisis, and that's hitting everybody in their homes, in their pockets, and I think it's built a lot of concern and fear. I think we also have a brewing food crisis, and we should look at food in a number of ways, certainly in terms of how that's going to hit consumers. It's a very severe potential hit. We're seeing food prices increasing. But I guess probably a couple of points to make on that is ultimately following energy and the rightful transition we've had on energy, we need to do the same on our food system globally. Our food system right now effectively responsible for 75% of all deforestation, 70% of all freshwater withdrawals, and nearly 30% of global emissions. So this is now starting to come to the fore, and we are going to have to tackle that too. Equally, we're going to have to tackle it when we're seeing some huge geopolitical shocks through Ukraine and Russia in terms of supply of fertilizer, wheat, but at the same time, we're seeing some climate shocks. We're seeing potentially failed droughts and harvests in Brazil, in the US, in Madagascar. So, as ever, this is a moment both for policy, for intervention, to start to put in place more stability around our food system, but actually start to remodel it for the future as well.
Okay, whilst we get the microphone to the gentleman with the white shirt in the middle. Yes, there's a gentleman over there who had his hand up. Oh, okay, all right, sorry. Yes, let's go there then. That's where the microphone is.
I'll go for it then.
Yeah, go on.
Claire Atkins-Morris from Sodexo. It's really great to hear lots about energy. We heard that a lot at COP26. Knowing what we're looking for at COP27, food and food systems is, again, not on the agenda. We also know that National Food Strategy probably isn't going to be released because of the Ukraine piece. So, Tanya, I know you've been really focusing on this, but what intervention can we do as businesses to either lobby or push the government to make sure that we don't fall into a similar crisis?
Thanks for that. Should we just take the next one as well? Have you got a mic? Yes.
Yeah, Dirk Campbell from the Money Rebellion Talk team again. It's a question for Sasha Wright. You're talking about a circular economy rather than a growth economy, the way it's currently modelled. Can you convince the representatives of industry here to transition to a post-growth economy in 3 minutes?
Okay. And then this gentleman over here. Yeah, done.
Hello, I'm Mark Crouch from Mark McDonald. Whilst we can be a bit sceptical about the degree to which net zero is actually being, delivered properly, what we can't deny is the success in it as a label, and it's entered common language. What do the panel think we need to do to get resilience and adaptation considered in the same way?
Okay, who wants to take? Do you want to take the I mean, you've mentioned the food piece as well. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, perhaps 2 minutes on food, and then I might turn to my esteemed colleague Chris in terms of a fast followership in terms of emissions. I mean, I would encourage any business leader to be raising these issues and applying appropriate pressure, certainly into government in terms of prioritising this. We can't afford, we genuinely don't have the time, and the science is telling us we don't have the time to just put this consistently on the back burner, both from a climate perspective, but also in terms of our own stability and resilience, both as a nation and indeed if you look at all the food sources and the commodities that we're importing every single day. So it's time that this was elevated, both in government policy, but also from a COP27 agenda perspective. I know that Alok Sharma, COP president, really has raised this with the Egyptians, the incoming presidency. Let's hope when they publish their plans that this firmly is on the agenda too.
The problem here is that the government is doing loads of trade deals. I mean, to just take a very practical example, then trade deals structurally tend to offer up access for agricultural markets for faraway countries, and this is like a kind of deeply held mission of the government. So are you saying that there's a climate imperative as to why they should hold back on that?
I think we should do trade deals, but they absolutely have to take the climate and nature impacts as part of that. The Australia trade deal is a classic example. That is probably it has the highest levels of deforestation of any OECD nation. And realistically, the climate impacts are not aligned through that trade deal. And we've made that clear.
The talk is of potentially somewhere along the line of you do a trade deal, it's free trade, and then you tariff them for the carbon impact.
Well, you're offshoring it. It's right, effectively, you're offshoring the damage elsewhere and hoping that everything will be okay. And it's not okay. And we're too connected for it not to be okay.
Well, that's a tricky one for government policy right now. Okay.
Well, I'll follow up on that. I mean, the underlying issue is we do need trade. For all of the challenges that we face on decarbonisation, trade helps. But you also need to very fundamentally say you cannot ask a farmer in Britain to do something that you wouldn't expect of some food that you would import from Australia, for example.
Yes, frozen.
So, indeed. So this issue of the carbon border that we put around the UK and indeed around Europe is going to become more and more of an issue, I think. But we will still need those trade deals. So I think it is possible to do both of these things at once.
Okay.
To have that outlook that you need well-connected markets, but also to have a clear-sighted view on how you erect the right set of tariffs and borders around the country so that you don't get that injustice on a set of producers here in the UK.
Do you want to pick up the challenge? I can give you 1 minute.
I would love to. What a question. I mean, I want to start out by saying I'm not necessarily here to convince you of the nitty-gritty of a circular economy. I would be lying if I said that as a 23-year-old from Canada with a Bachelor's of Science degree, I'm the right person to do that. I would say you're definitely the person to explain the nitty-gritty of it. So I won't put you guys through a minute of me rambling. But what I will say is that I am here to motivate you to have the courage and the curiosity to open your mind to the possibility of what it actually means to be sustainable. In the work that we do at Force of Nature, we speak with young people all around the world, and we've found that 70% of young people feel powerless to make a difference. And 70% of them also feel like there's no point working towards a better future because it's not possible. And I implore you to think about the fact that that is your sons and your daughters and your nieces and your nephews and your future. And what the science and the experts have told me and told us is that a circular economy, the concept of regeneration, of drawdown, is our best bet at moving forward towards that. So with that, I will hand it over to you.
Well, I think you're exactly the right person to talk about that, Sasha. But let me address the last question on adaptation and resilience, because it flows very much this idea of needing a holistic approach. Can I just ask you a quick poll? How many of the people in this room are part of a company that is part of the Race to Zero campaign, the big campaign around COP26? Can you just raise your hands? Good. And can you keep your hands in the air if you're also part of the Race to Resilience, the same campaign for adaptation and resilience? Sorry, so a big difference, right? And this is I think exactly underscoring why this question is so good, it's absolutely essential to focus on treatment. We're past the time where we can only focus on prevention. And the business community, I think, is beginning to wake up to that. It's less easy to know what exactly the target sets looks like, but there's a lot of great organizations, campaigns working on that. Race Resilience is one umbrella for them. I would highly encourage you to make that your next priority.
Just expand a little bit on what that would mean practically.
So the campaign has this, targets of setting, building resilience for, I forget exactly the numbers, but something like 1 billion people by 2030, helping the X number of communities become more adapted to the effects of climate change. And it does that through getting businesses in particular to think about how they might, for example, change their infrastructure building to be more climate resilient, how they might change their products to help I know for in the food spaces you were talking about, Tanya, become more reliant on natural, biodiverse, friendly systems to be able to weather the effects of climate change more easily than a kind of monoculture plantation could. So it gets very gritty and very technical very quickly, but that's no reason not to dive into it.
So I recently, this is a very interesting anecdote that's just occurred to me, which is that I was told very concretely that in the post-pandemic kind of return to the office, maybe not, there's been a highly significant premium now on green buildings in terms of rental. So you're seeing market mechanisms having some impact. In fact, I think they call them brown buildings, are unrentable when you combine it with the lack of demand or lower demand for some office space. So you are seeing this market mechanism starting to fire and create incentives, I think. So, and there are other examples of that. I guess it's the general picture, though, that there isn't enough of that kind of market disciplining, forcing people down your straight and true path.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So I think the kind of general concept of market mechanisms using the market to deliver the decarbonisation is exactly what has actually delivered the success we've seen so far in the UK. We would always say we could have done much more. Yeah. But it's exactly that market shaping that you need to see in the building sector, for example. We've got quite an interesting moment actually coming up. We've got a government that's actually willing now to tackle the challenge of decarbonising those buildings. They're going at it with quite interesting market mechanisms. They're asking people that make boilers to produce more and more of the alternative heat pumps. Now that might work. Yeah. We haven't seen the kind of final structure of that market incentive. Question, are consumers ready for that? Hasn't really been tackled by the government either. So I'm very up for those kind of market incentives across the piece. The area where we don't see them at all, and this is a massive issue, comes back to the point on food, is in farming. We don't see it in land use, we don't see it in farming. I don't know what the magical measure is that the government thinks will deliver the emissions pathway that they've signed up to for land use and agriculture, but it isn't out there right now. That is an area where you need that kind of shaping in place, and it takes time to put that in place, and time is the one thing we don't have.
Okay, great. As you can see, 0, 0, 0, 0 there, which means we're out of time. But just, we've got in one sentence, just give us an inspiring piece of best practice that you have come across for business to copy. Go.
It's the classic, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So set some targets, set about measurement, and actually get some of your youngest and best on it. They are incredibly motivated to focus on this and help the transition.
Oh, she nicked it. But
no,
I've got one more. So don't just have a net zero target at the level of your business. Think actively about what you can actually do to fuel the national transition. So don't just stick some solar panels on your roof. We'll have decarbonised electricity before you know it. Think more about the things that aren't happening so quickly in this country. Have you got a fleet of electric vehicles out there, for example? Think about how you can actually push the national transition even more quickly than it is happening through government policy.
And Tom?
I think one of the most far-sighted things businesses are doing is to support not just their own actions, but a regulatory environment that's going to make net zero not just a kind of good to have or some CSR type thing, but actually the baseline rule of the economy. That's happening for disclosure, it's happening for decision plans, it's happening for a number of other areas, and that's where I think smart businesses are now working.
Sasha, last word.
Oh, I love being asked to be inspiring.
Give us an example of something where it's really worked.
I think what I will say is I'll bring it back to a kind of different concept, which is more around you all as individuals. And I would encourage you, as I said earlier, to have courage and to have curiosity. I think that the discomfort and the fear and the anxiety that we all sit in here today having these really difficult conversations, shuffling responsibility, feeling it on ourselves, feeling the guilt and the shame, let that be your superpower. It's proof of your empathy, it's proof that you care, and it's really proof that we have the motivation and the power to do something. So tap into that discomfort, speak with people that make you feel uncomfortable, and it'll push you in the right direction.
Great, and hopefully when I find my SD card of this event in 2035, we'll have made more progress. Anyway, thanks very much for listening to us. Really appreciate that. Thanks very much for the excellent panel. Thank you. Cheers. Thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Faisal team, thank you very much indeed. As you said, we have hit half time, so lunch is upon us. In fact, we're into stoppage time of first half, I believe. But if people are popping out, please could you hold on to your lanyards so that we can reuse them on re-entry, or if not, pass them to a member of staff. Lunch is available in the stairs downstairs where you had the coffee and tea break. And can I ask that people are back here at 1:30 sharp, because Alok Sharma, our next guest, has a hard stop at the end of his session, so we want to make sure we maximise the time available in discussion with Tony. For now, enjoy lunch. Thank you.